Hello, and welcome to our lunch hour learning webinar, Green Bylaws in Action in the Lower Mainland. I'm Renee Frappier, coordinator for the SCBC Green Bylaws Toolkit project and co-host for today's session. Now we're going to discuss some of the earnest work of local governments that want to prioritize the implementation of green practices, projects, policies, and bylaws on the Lower Mainland. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that all of this work is happening on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Kakite, Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Coquitlam, and the Stolo nations, who have stewarded these lands and waters since time immemorial. In case you aren't familiar with the Stewardship Center, we are a nonprofit society that focuses on providing science-based information, tools, and resources to help individuals and organizations and local governments make informed ecological stewardship decisions, like the Green Bylaws Toolkit. We always work collaboratively, relying on our partner organizations, technical experts, and funders to achieve our common goals. Our work falls under three broad categories: our green shores, nature-based solutions for shoreline protection; wildlife and species at risk, which includes the Green Bylaws Toolkit; and our popular Cats and Birds project. Third is strengthening stewardship, which includes our new project, Green Spaces for All, which works to provide equitable access to the benefits, health, and resiliency that come with green spaces in urban environments. Now, since this is a Zoom webinar, your video is turned off and your microphones are muted. However, you can type questions into the chat and we'll do our best to answer each one. I hope you enjoy the webinar and your lunch. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our co-host, Ione Smith. Ione is a professional agrologist with a background in agricultural planning and land resource science. She founded Upland Agricultural Consulting in 2010, specializing in innovative agriculture and food security plans, climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies, and farm business plans. She's worked with Indigenous communities, governments of all levels, and non-governmental organizations as well. In addition to her consulting work, Ione serves as vice chair of the Agricultural Land Commission and is an instructor at SFU, where she teaches community economic development approaches to food. And now I'd like to turn it over to you, Ione. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks again, Renee. So as Renee mentioned, my name is Ione Smith. I'm an agrologist. I'm not a planner, but I'm always on the lookout for exciting examples of successful environmental initiatives happening at the local level around the province. So I'm excited to hear from the panelists today. We've lined up some great speakers that are going to shine some light on some of the most innovative work happening in the Lower Mainland and showcase their recipes for success. But first, I'm going to run through a really short overview of the third edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit before I turn it over to our speakers. So the focus of the third edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit is really on the natural environment and green infrastructure. Most of you working within this realm have a good grasp of what green infrastructure is. It's the natural and semi-natural areas with environmental and engineered features, and it's the sum total of ecosystem elements that maintain biodiversity and the functioning of our ecosystems. It's also considered to be the foundation of our communities, and it really requires a network of connectivity to thrive. Local governments have an important role to play. They can aim to plan and manage within their areas to enhance nature's ability to deliver a wide range of what we call ecosystem services, to support biodiversity in both rural and urban settings, and provide economic, environmental, and societal benefits to all of us in the community. These can obviously be planned strategically to create a cohesive green infrastructure network. And green infrastructure and biodiversity are best protected and enhanced when they're considered together. Areas of biodiversity can be connected through green infrastructure. This is a bit of a headache to look at, but it really is just to illustrate that the authority for local governments really rests in supporting the natural environment and biodiversity from the provincial government, who delegates powers to local governments, primarily through the Local Government Act and the Community Charter. Some of the most important authority for environmental protection relates to land use with tools and levers such as regional growth strategies, official community plans, zoning bylaws, and of course, the ability to establish development permit areas. However, other powers, such as for regulatory bylaws for tree and watercourse protection, or for soil deposit and removal, can also play an important role. Local governments have significant authority for green infrastructure and protection of natural environment, and there is still a lot of room for improvement. No local government uses the full extent of their powers that I'm aware of for protecting and restoring the natural environment, and a lot of that comes down to political will. But the overarching goal is to take a nested approach to green bylaws, to focus on green bylaws through the whole policy and regulatory continuum regarding infrastructure at all scales. The toolkit itself presents 5 key observations about the structure of local government's ecological protection approaches. The first is, as I mentioned, local governments should take a nested approach to environmental health, from a regional plan focused on connectivity to local government-specific commitments and regulations for individual properties. Secondly, there's a need for planning through bylaws and community support, and people will not subject themselves to regulations unless they feel it is part of something bigger. This creates a culture of conservation within a community. Third, the focus on healthy communities, whether it be ecosystems, biodiversity, or both, rather than allowing for the conversation to center on individual property rights in land, is important. It's about water management, compact efficient development, protection of property, and biodiversity, and that needs to be the focus. Number 4 is that creating ecosystem-based, measurable performance-based objectives or targets, such as saying 95% of new development will occur within the urban containment boundary, or the community is committed to restoring 5 kilometers of riparian habitat to a specific standard. These create better directions for the exercise of discretion in individual decisions about bylaws or applications when they come to staff and council. They can include overall metrics that are embedded in regional data, plans, or projects with specific milestones. And lastly, we have seen very general guidelines with good results. We've also seen detailed mapping and guidelines with poor uptake. The idea is that we don't need better information at this point to make pretty good decisions, but we do need to act based on the information that we have at hand. So I'm going to turn it over in a minute to our panel presenters. I'll introduce each of them first before I hand it over. They'll each have 5 or 10 minutes to talk about some of the specific projects that they're undertaking within their communities. And then, as Renee mentioned, there's going to be opportunity for question and answer period. So as you listen to the speakers, feel free to jot down your questions within the Q&A function. Today's webinar includes 3 great speakers. First, we're going to hear from Yolanda Leung. Yolanda is a landscape design coordinator with the Township of Langley. In her previous role in the Green Infrastructure Services Department, she worked with developers and their consultants and contractors to apply bylaws and guidelines and to encourage good design. She now works in the Parks Design and Development Department, where she works with the public and community organizations on a variety of projects. She has served on various committees as an involved member of the BC Society of Landscape Architects. Yolanda's educational experience includes a certificate in urban design from SFU and a bachelor's of landscape architecture from UBC. And Yolanda will be sharing her observations about trails implemented through land development in the township. Secondly, we'll hear from Brianne Labute. Brianne is a registered professional planner with the District of North Vancouver. During her time at various coastal municipalities, Brianne has led projects that explore the use of planning tools to encourage nature-based solutions. Brianne is a Green Shores Local Government Working Group member and has completed the Green Shores Level 3 training. Brianne has a master's in rural planning from my alma mater, the University of Guelph. And third, we have Matthew MacKinnon. Matt is a registered professional biologist and environmental manager with 17 years of experience protecting natural resources in the municipal sector. Matt's experience and expertise includes environmental impact assessments, water quality, stream and habitat protection, generating environmental protection plans, and serving as a public and regulatory liaison. Matt has a Master's of Science in Environmental Science Education from Southern Oregon University. So I am going to turn it over now to Yolanda.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to my talk, which I've entitled Corridors for Critters and Communities. So I wanted to take the opportunity to present some of the projects that I'd worked on in my role in the Green Infrastructure Services Department. So I work for the Township of Langley, which is located approximately 45 kilometers east of the city of Vancouver, covers approximately 316 square kilometers. We have 1,700 kilometers of water courses, and we're a growing and developing municipality. Through this talk, I'm going to be sharing some of my observations, identify some of the bylaws and the guidelines that I'd used, and present a few examples. So to start off, I wanted to share with you some of the things that my future self would tell my past self about some of these corridors that have been provided through development. First of all, is to be patient, to be persistent, to protect the corridor during, before, during, and after construction. Remember that things will grow and that people care. So as some of you may already know, the Township of Langley uses neighborhood plans to guide development in our new neighborhoods. One of the projects that I want to speak to is an ecological greenway in the Yorkson neighborhood. And I'll be talking a bit about how that ecological greenway connects with the Northeast Gordon neighborhood to the south. And at some point, those ecological greenways are going to be connected through the Smith neighborhood. Trails and greenways are neighborhood requirements. They're required as services provided by developers. And to help developers, we have prepared a little brochure called Ecological Greenways and Trails, a guide for developers. It's actually available from the township website if you want to search for it. And it talks about some of the considerations that staff would look for in the design and construction of these ecological greenways. So ecological greenways are intended to protect wildlife habitats and facilitate movement between habitats. Conceptually, the ecological greenways are approximately 30 meters wide with a pedestrian corridor off to the side next to the development side with a 3-meter wide shared asphalt walkway, some fencing to separate the corridor from private property. And it has enhanced and retained vegetation within that corridor. So that corridor is defined, as I mentioned, by fences and gates, and we've got signs that identify regulation and provide a consistent frontage or appearance for these corridors. Sometimes the corridors are share space with streamside protection areas, and we've got some fencing that separates the corridors or the pedestrians from the intentionally undisturbed vegetation. One of the trails that I wanted to share with you is the Perry Evans Trail. It connects 209th Street with 76th Avenue. The trails are, the conceptual corridors are identified in the neighborhood plans and chosen because of the potential alignment and the existing vegetation. So in 2010, pre-development, there was quite a bit of vegetation in what we had planned for the Perry Evans Trail. Unfortunately, in 2013, the corridor was accidentally cleared, and we needed to have the restoration plan prepared by the developer. You can see in the screenshot from Google Earth in August 2014, there was not very much. We had some replanting done. Fortunately, in 2023, you can see that the vegetation is filled in and there's quite a lot of cover and lots of room and opportunity for wildlife to use the ecological greenway, this corridor for these critters, as well as room for the community to walk and enjoy this natural setting. So it's filled in quite nicely. The other example that I wanted to share with you is an ecological greenway in the Northeast Gordon neighborhood. And this is a combination of ecological greenway with some streamside protection areas. So we have quite a large undisturbed vegetated area that connects 208 A Street with 72 Avenue. Both Perry Evans Trail and Steveston Trail cross roads. And so under the roads, we have some wildlife tunnels that provide an off-road opportunity for critters to move from green space to green space. And conceptually, we've got some box culverts and some slopes, some vegetation, a gravel floor, and I can share with you some photos of wildlife tunnels that were under construction. I think this is under 209 Street. And some examples of how these wildlife tunnels have filled in and contribute to the habitat opportunities for critters. My third example is the Bertrand Creek Trail, which is mostly alongside some streamside protection areas. And I wanted to share this because it has its own Instagram page. And I think that is an example of how the public has adopted and taken ownership of some of these corridors. And I feel that they look after the corridors and enjoy them and appreciate them. This other photo in this slide is of some fairy houses that the community has added along the Steveston Trail. One of the other components that we've required in our ecological greenways and streamside trails is some of interpretive signage, which tries to describe things and excite the public about different things that they're going to find in these trail corridors. So to sum up, we have to be patient. The Perry Evans Trail took many years to construct. I think it was about 9 years. Steveston Trail, about 4 years. Bertrand Creek, 4 years. So it does take some time. We need to be persistent and to keep advocating for the vegetation, the design, and protection of the corridor. We've been more stringent about protecting the corridor before construction to make sure that we don't have situations where there's accidental clearing again. Protected during construction to deter unauthorized access or storage of materials, and after construction to encourage the public, the community, to respect and maintain these opportunities for critters. My comment about things will grow is a reference to the accidental clearing of Perry Evans Trail and how things did actually fill in. And I wanted to also thank people for caring, because the ferry houses, the people, the dog walkers who stay on the trail, all of that has been really beneficial. And I think it contributes to the corridors for communities. So thank you very much.
That's great, Yolanda. Thank you so much. We loved all the photos. It was so nice to see the before and after as well.
Great, thank you.
We've got some questions are coming in. We're going to hold all the questions till the end of our 3 presentations, but it's great to see these questions coming in. And Yolanda, you might want to answer some of them by typing your answer. It's up to you, or we'll wait until the end. I'm going to switch gears now to Brianne. Brianne, are you ready? All right.
I am ready. Let's see if
Take it away.
technology cooperates. Okay. It's always the hardest part of presenting these days.
Yeah, that looks great. You're good to go.
Great. No speaking notes. Those are only seen by me. Okay, sounds good. Well, now I'm having a moment of regret and wishing that I put a map of the District of North Vancouver, because I see that there was one question that popped up in the chat about the city of North Vancouver. So although I don't have a map, we are 2 different municipalities. The District of North Vancouver, I think, is a really interesting municipality to work in because we have a little bit of everything. Coastal municipality with industrial uses, residential development, urban centers that are growing. So we really have a diverse range of things that we need to look at when we're thinking about green bylaws. So what I'm going to focus in on today is some technical work that we're doing that would support developing new coastal regulations, and why I think that that technical work is a really important component. Okay, there we go. So we do have a history, I would say, at the District of North Vancouver of protecting coastal environments. We I'm gonna move something over my speaking notes here. There we go. Through bylaws, development permits, and also through policies. So one of the main tools we kind of use on our coastline is an environmental protection and preservation bylaw, which was enacted back in the 90s, and I think was considered quite progressive at the time. And that applies kind of broadly to our aquatic areas. We also have a number of environmental and hazard development permit areas that intersect with the coastline, predominantly because we have streams and things that outlet into the ocean, but we don't have a development permit at the moment that's specific to the coast. And then we have a number of really great policy documents that ultimately support the district continuing to work on the evolution and improvement of green bylaws. Some notable ones are from 2017, we did a climate change adaptation strategy, and then a big piece of work in terms of sea level rise. We worked with other North Shore municipalities, the emergency management, also local First Nations, to come up with a regional strategy to tackle sea level rise. So this next project that I'm going to talk to is coming out of the recommendations of some of those documents. All right, so green bylaw development in progress right now. We are working on a coastal development permit area. As I mentioned, right now, we often use that environmental protection and preservation bylaw. But oh, I think Yolanda's still...
Yeah, I just sent Yolanda a message. If you, Yolanda, can you go on mute? Because there's some background noise there. Perfect. Thank you.
I'm at home and it's actually quiet today, so I figured it wasn't me. So one thing we're working on is this coastal development permit area. And part of the reason for that is we recognize that the bylaw we've been using, this environmental protection and preservation bylaw, may not be the best tool anymore. Obviously, the authorities in the Local Government Act have kind of changed over 30 years, and the tools that local governments have available to them have as well. So we would be developing this new development permit area and taking some of those components out of that older environmental bylaw. Right now, we're really focused on this. So I do have half of a map of the district, this specific area of the district here. And the reason that we've chosen to tackle this area first is that it's predominantly kind of a residential and commercial area. The rest of the district's coastline is quite complex industrial uses. We have different complex industrial uses. We have cross-sectional authority with the Port Authority being involved as well. So we're going to tackle those kind of at a later date. But right now the focus is here. And the purpose of this development permit area will be twofold. We want to look at environmental protection, but then also protection of development from hazardous conditions. So if you're familiar with the development permit tool, there is also an option to kind of separate those out and have different permitting processes. But ultimately, we really think that those two things go hand in hand. Like, for example, the development permit regulations contain guidelines that promote nature-based solutions to hazard management. So looking at kind of like a green shoulders approach for shoreline protection, for example. So that's why we think it's really important that we combine them into one permitting process. Oops. I'll go back for a minute there. Okay. And so to support this work on the technical side of things, we did apply to last year's intake of Union of BC Municipalities usually has a yearly intake for their Disaster Risk Reduction Climate Adaptation Fund. And so we applied to that to do some updated coastal flood hazard mapping. And we were successful in getting that grant. And the reason we applied for that is because we did a lot of great mapping, floodplain mapping, during the development of this sea level rise strategy. But unfortunately, there was only so much funding available at that time, and it was really focused on the risk assessment piece. And so that mapping didn't include the level of detail that is really beneficial at the site-specific level. So it didn't include just still water flood levels, which means that it doesn't include effects from wind-generated waves. And that can be a key component because in some areas that does increase both the flood risk and then the erosion risk as well. So just a little bit more on that technical piece that we're working on right now with that grant funding. So the first thing that's being done by our consultants is they're working on a hydrodynamic model, and that's to determine the total kind of extreme water levels that can happen. And also they'd be creating a wave model to determine how far the waves are actually going to run up onto land, wind-generated waves. And I think this part's really interesting because we have really great data now that we didn't have even 5 years ago. Like we have a 2022, it's called a LiDAR data set that shows the topography in the area that is so detailed that you can even tell when somebody's excavating their basement. So we've got some really great topographical data. And then we also have data in terms of like the water depths. Then they've merged all that together to create a digital elevation model, which is essentially kind of like the digital twin of what's out there in real life. And once we have that model available, they can simulate coastal processes to kind of determine where the flood levels are going to be. So I think we've come a long way in terms of like what we can use data for and the products that it can produce. So from that modeling, the consultants will prepare inundation maps, so how far the flood will go up on land, and then also flood construction level mapping. And we're going to be looking at both the 100 and 200 year flood level, and then also multiple sea level rise scenarios, like what present day, 0.5 meters and 1 meter. Because this is really important to us because what we've kind of learned of late from other resources is that the province suggests that we plan for 1 meter by the year 2100, and that may be overly conservative based on more recent science that's coming in. So if we have at least a range of scenarios, then as that science evolves, we can plan in accordance to that. So in the final piece of our technical work is that our consultants will undertake a high-level erosion analysis to identify potentially vulnerable areas. And this is really important because it helps determine how far buildings should be set back, because you want to look at where potential erosion will be over time and then make sure you still have enough space. And that's really important for riparian areas too. Like if we're going to lose some of that riparian area over time to say sea level rise, then we want to make sure we're setting buildings further back to account for that. So the consultants will do this by reviewing. We have aerial photos from back in the 50s, actually. They're a bit granular or a bit hard to see, but over time they get better and better, and they are enough to be able to see changes in the coastline. We also did a great kind of boat tour all the way up the Indian Arm to do some visual observation of what's happening along the coastline. And then they'll also do some numerical modeling of shear bed stresses. So what's kind of happening with the wave energy that could potentially increase erosion in some areas. So why does this matter? Why are we going through all this effort to do this technical work? I thought I'd kind of focus on this piece since we're so early in the development of the coastal development permit tool itself. We're really focused on the technical work right now. So I thought I'd focus on why we've chosen that approach, because we actually did in the early days of the project explore just doing a coastal development permit without doing the technical work. And that would have put a bit more of the onus on the landowner to come up with some of that information through their professionals at time of development. So firstly, I think that local governments have a really great opportunity to utilize grants, and sometimes these grants are quite generous from upper levels of government, to do this detailed technical work that would be really hard to do on like kind of a site-specific basis. So having that technical information freely available to applicants will ultimately reduce, hopefully, the level of effort that they have to do on their end or their consulting professionals have to do. And when possible, I really think local governments should pursue these opportunities, but I will acknowledge it's still a lot of work to put the grant applications in and to manage the consulting team. So it's not as easy as kind of going for everything, but if you really think about potential benefits, it can be worthwhile. And then conducting the technical work can be really important for identifying the extent of the hazard. So often if we don't have this information, we're having to create a really big net, cast a big net for where the area to be regulated should be, because we don't actually know on the ground where the hazard or the environmentally sensitive area is. And then ultimately it's up to the applicant to provide evidence to us that there's nothing there. So if we do this technical work, then we're able to instead identify exactly where these areas are with some certainty and reduce the area that will ultimately be regulated. And I think that's really important because the alternative approach where you just cast a really wide net, I think can lead to a little bit of distrust in the development process and a bit of frustration on the side of people who are trying to develop their properties. And I also think that it can reduce reliance on the professional reliance model. So without this technical information, you're usually asking for professional reports to be provided. Of course, there could be a bit of variation in the recommendations in those reports, depending on who does them. So having the information at the local government level is really helpful to kind of apply more consistency. And lastly, I think it's really important to have this technical information because we can monitor change over time. So in this case, we'll now have a baseline of potential flood levels over time, and we'll be able to update kind of predictions as we get better data and look at changes. So we're really excited to have that. Of course, I do want to acknowledge that technical work is also not without its challenges. I didn't do a separate slide on this, but requires staff time, money, internal consensus on what your approach is going to be, and then also political buy-in. You have to get council approval often even just to apply for these grant opportunities. So that can be a bit of a challenge. But that said, I think investing in technical work shows that the local government is committed to understanding and regulating hazards in an efficient and comprehensive manner. So it is important to do so. And that is everything for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brianne. That was great. I loved hearing about that technical piece at the end too. It's important not to miss it. Thank you so much for that. So Matt, we're gonna queue up your presentation if you can share your screen. And I know Matt and Brianne both work for the District of North Vancouver, and so it's great to get these two perspectives. The questions are coming in and they're great to see. I'm sort of, there's a bunch related to wildlife tunnels, so I'm trying to collect those into one big kind of question, and some others coming in now for Brianne, so that's fantastic. Keep them coming. And Matt, I will turn it over to you. We can see your screen just fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Brianne. Really interesting work going on in the community planning with the coastal DPA. Apologies, I'm a bit hoarse from a cold this morning, but we'll carry on. So I'm going to introduce the District of North Vancouver's Nature and Biodiversity Strategy. And this really, the idea and intent here is for this high level and overarching strategy to be a roadmap for protecting and enhancing ecosystems throughout the district. So I'll just share briefly what the purpose of the strategy is, why the district needs a biodiversity strategy, as well as some of the potential outcomes we'd like to see out of this strategy. I'll tell you a little bit first about our group. It's the Climate and Biodiversity Office at the district. And this relatively new group was established in 2021. And our mandate is to work across the district organization with all of the departments to advance climate action in 6 key areas. And so the nature and biodiversity strategy that we're discussing today falls roughly under the area of healthy ecosystems. So as with all municipalities, the District of North Vancouver depends on healthy ecosystems. They have cultural and social as well as economic benefits. They contribute to the region's overall livability. And of course, they support biodiversity in the region. And our natural areas have also been supported by a history of land stewardship by Indigenous peoples. Our natural areas, we're recognizing that they're being put under increasing amount of stress, not only from their popularity, but the impacts of urban growth. We've got the new provincial guidance with regards to housing development, invasive species, pollution events, you name it, all of that along with the impacts of climate change. So to help address this issue, the district is developing this nature and biodiversity strategy. So here I've developed this little cross section here of some of the district's urban environments, urban and rural environments, along with some of the components of nature and biodiversity in the district. And our natural and urban areas, you'll see they connect to the North Shore Mountains here in the background, which provide a habitat for a diversity of animal and plant species. And I'll also note our sort of within our urban matrix, our woodlands also provide extensive habitat for birds, particularly during the spring migration events. So all of these components of nature contribute to a resilient and sustainable district. So as many of you know, biodiversity ecosystems can increase our resilience to climate change impacts, such as extreme heat and flooding. And I think I only mentioned these benefits that are often called ecosystem services. So things like managing our stormwater, cooling our city streets and our boulevards. And we also know that nature's crucial for our physical and mental health. We learned in the COVID pandemic that people need to connect with nature that's easily accessible. Now, green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, you've heard that term, I imagine. They'll play an expanding role in the district for capturing stormwater from high-intensity rainstorm events. And this green infrastructure, as it's called, refers to the types of both natural and engineered assets that provide climate change benefits. So we anticipate seeing more green infrastructure throughout the district over time, and bringing nature into our more urban environments, into the urban matrix through our conservation efforts, through environmental protection measures, as well as through restoration efforts, can help support biodiversity within our more urban environments. The role of local government is pretty important here with regards to nature and ecosystems. There's a variety of mechanisms that local governments can be used, and both Ione and I think Brianne touched on this. We can address these environmental initiatives through land use and urban planning, through licensing and regulation, even through like advocacy and corporate leadership, for examples. So local government really is best equipped here to restore ecosystems on the ground and in tangible ways. Just briefly, in terms of policy context, the nature and biodiversity strategy, it's aligned with our district's official community plan, as well as our climate change adaptation strategy. And it will also have some close links to some recent parks initiatives. For example, our Parks and Open Space Plan and our Natural Areas Trail strategy. And as Brianne mentioned, the district does have a long-standing of demonstrating environmental leadership. And so this nature and biodiversity strategy builds on all of that work completed to date. There's 5 milestones to the nature and biodiversity strategy. We're currently in the assess milestone of this project. And this really is where the natural areas of the district will be looked at and analyzed to understand their capacity to support biodiversity. And that's going to be built on some of the basic tenets of biodiversity. Following that work, the district will be conducting some broader engagement with the community on the findings of the biodiversity assessment. And of course, our work isn't finished once the strategy is completed. That's when the tough work begins. We need to implement this strategy and monitor our progress over time. The biodiversity assessment, it'll start with a review of some of the current state of natural areas in the district. And there's several new and, well, not necessarily new, but powerful technologies to help us understand the state of biodiversity, including LiDAR, remote sensing, GIS data sets, and even, as Brianne referred to, the digital elevation models, where we can look at and identify ephemeral or remnant creeks within the municipality. And so these powerful technologies will form the primary data set to analyze and rank biodiversity throughout the district. Some of the desired outcomes of the nature and biodiversity strategy, I've mirrored these based on some of the work coming out of the province with their ecosystem health framework. So, of course, we want to see healthy ecosystem. That starts with starting to maintain and restore biodiversity throughout the district. We want to either doing this through enhanced stewardship or through directly funded project. We're really hoping that this work advances reconciliation and acknowledging that biodiversity is a really critical role for First Nations and integral to the rights and title of First Nations. Effective stewardship is an important approach. We want this work to be endorsed by the public, and we want this work to be collaborative. We want it to occur through joint efforts. And as well, one of the outcomes is a more resilient district. So can this work foster a more sustainable economy, facilitating the recovery of ecosystems, and of course, making us more resilient to climate change impacts? I'll end just by noting that we see the interlinked challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change, and so it's really going to require cooperation among everyone. We're all going to have to roll up our sleeves here and take a sort of a whole of community approach to this strategy. So there's no one person or government department alone that will be able to make this strategy successful. It's going to require multiple champions at multiple levels for this project to be successful. So with that, I want to thank you and ready to answer questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. So we've got some great questions coming in. I'm going to start with some questions for Yolanda because I think she's had the benefit of being able to look at the questions. So Yolanda, if you're able to go off mute, there was a sort of bundle of questions that came in around the wildlife corridors and in particular the tunnels. So I'm just going to kind of go through the points that folks were keen to hear more details about. So there was the design aspect. I see that you answered a couple of those questions regarding asphalt versus gravel and things like that. And there was some question around fencing, also putting grids on the tunnels and how that might impact the mobility of some wildlife.
Right.
And then there were some questions around the maintenance of them. So for example, if there's invasive species, is there staff at the township that takes care of that, or is it funded by development? The maintenance of that. And then, yeah, just overall, how do you choose where to install the corridors and so forth? So, yeah, do you want to kind of speak to some of those points?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. Okay, let's see. So can you refresh me about the questions again?
Sure. Yeah, we can go through them one at a time. So Tanya from Abbotsford had a question about fencing. So do you always fence the trails along the edges, particularly when there's a stream setback?
Along the stream side, yeah. Yes, we do. And we have a standard fence detail. Staff call it the stream side fence, and it's in our subdivision and development servicing bylaw. It's one of the TLP details, and it's a low 3-foot high fence with 2 wooden rails and some page wire fabric. So it is intended to allow visual access to the stream side area next to the stream or next to the trail so that people can enjoy it. But it is intended to deter access by people and their dogs, for example.
Right.
One of the things that we're going to be incorporating in the next update is to have a little bit of a gap underneath the bottom of the fabric to help our friends in operations to blow leaves and vegetation back into the stream side area. Yeah, we do have a fence to define the pedestrian corridor along stream side trails.
And you sort of started to delve into the maintenance piece. So how are the trails maintained and who does that work? Is that a staff job or is that volunteers?
Yeah, it's a staff job. We have a crew in our trees, trails, and horticulture. I think that's the new department name. We have a crew who go out and maintain the trails for public safety. So they'll look after clearances, make sure the surfaces are intact and safe. And they do that on their regular schedule, the regular maintenance.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then lastly, one last tunnel question for you around the grids. Does that have an impact on the ability for larger animals to use it, or you're probably trying to keep debris out would be my guess, but
keep debris out and keep people out of the box culverts. They are I believe the detail calls for them to be padlocked so that they are secure. There is a maximum opening between the grid bars that I believe is intended to allow smaller terrestrial mammals to use the tunnels, but to deter larger mammals. They're not intended for, the deer or bears that we might get in Langley.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. And then kind of like taking a zoom out perspective in terms of the strategy itself, what's the name of the trail strategy?
Oh, overall, we have the Through Community Connections Trail Strategy. Okay. There had also been some studies. I think our long range planning department had worked with UBC to identify potential corridors, locations of promising vegetation, and that information was incorporated into the neighborhood plans. Okay. So the corridors, the roads, park locations, and the locations of wildlife tunnels is all identified in the neighborhood plan, and that is what guides development and build out of the neighborhood.
Okay, perfect. That helps to answer a lot of the extra questions that were there.
Great.
Okay. So I will move now to North Vancouver speakers. One of the questions here is about what sort of efforts are there to enact the nature-based solutions that would benefit the climate strategy for the circular economy and the solid waste reduction work. Can you speak to any of that in terms of that alignment, I guess?
I guess I can take a stab at that. I think a lot of it depends on working closely with your various departments in terms of implementing green infrastructure and other nature-based solutions. For example, you really need to get your team, as in the entire organization, needs to get a handle on what the core objectives are before projects even started. So, for example, our engineering group now knows that retention of large diameter trees is one of the core objectives before starting any project. And so that really helps the whole team move in the right direction in terms of environmental protection and restoration efforts.
Okay, great. There's a few questions here about development permit areas, so I'll see if I can bundle them together. So the first one was about how do you get community buy-in for development permit areas? Is there community engagement happening? And also how to protect ecologically sensitive lands without the power to create DPAs in some cases. And also, has the District of North Vancouver considered the exemption of certain properties in DPAs regarding the new provincial housing regulations? Does anybody want to take a stab?
I can try those. I'm not so sure about the second one, but the first one, in terms of community engagement, absolutely. So at the technical work stage, we are looking at kind of informing the community about the technical work that's going on. That's also a really great opportunity to kind of pre-educate a little bit about coastal processes and flood risk before we get into like the meatier discussions about the coastal development permit area itself. And interestingly, in the district, like even though it's a new development permit area, we are still regulating this area through that environmental bylaw, also through certain authorities under the community charters for building permits. So not so much is going to change on the ground for what like applicants have to do to get permits, but it's just a more modernized way of doing so. So we're looking forward to having conversations with the community on that topic. And then the second question was around what do you do if you don't have DPA authority? Someone kind of left me scratching my head a little bit because that means you wouldn't be applicable to the Local Government Act. So assuming you would be kind of outside British Columbia.
Maybe it's just suggesting they don't have any in place at the moment.
Or don't have any in place yet.
Yeah. No political will to put any in, for example.
Yeah. Okay. That's a fair point. Then the tool's available, but maybe there isn't political buy-in to do so. I think that's when you look at the nesting approach. Like I think it was really interesting to see Ion's initial slides that show all the tools are available for local government. So maybe you're warming up the community with a tree bylaw. And then from that, you're looking at other environmental bylaws. So you don't have to go all in right away with a development permit, which can be kind of more all-encompassing. So I think it's really understanding legally what's available to you. And of course, as creatures of the province, we often wish there were even more tools available to us to regulate, but we try to maximize what we have the authority to do. And then the last one's on Bill 44, so housing related. So I figured this one would come up because obviously a really hot topic in BC right now. For those of you on the call that don't know, the province announced recent housing legislation that could see kind of up to 3 to 6 units on most residential lots, depending on their lot size. Now, within that legislation, there is the ability to exempt certain lands if they're subject to a hazard that cannot be mitigated. So all local governments are basically at that step right now. They're taking a look at where the legislation is supposed to apply. And then if there are potential areas where they should be exempt from that higher density because there is a hazard that cannot be mitigated. Now that hazard could be potentially like flood risk or slope risk. So most local governments are in the process of doing that analysis along with qualified professionals that can provide advice on those matters. So it's kind of a to be determined when local governments start bringing their bylaws forward, which they do have to have those adopted by the end of June. Then there'll be maps available and things that show which lands will be subject to the new legislation and which ones wouldn't.
Great. Thanks, Brianne. There's a couple more kind of technical questions for Matt around, there's one about the remote sensing that you're using, and is it being used to assess the state of biodiversity and how is that being analyzed? And then kind of connected to that, have natural assets been considered as part of the biodiversity strategy, or is it more focused on the socio-ecological values?
Yeah, great question about remote sensing. I don't have an answer. I don't know how it will be used yet. I suspect there'll be more of a focus on the orthophotos, the LiDAR, as well as our canopy coverage for various portions of the district. We measure canopy coverage by neighborhood. So I'm suspecting that a lot of the biodiversity assessment will rank biodiversity values based on that data set more than the remote sensing data set. As well, we're planning to use the indicator species approach. So looking at a guild of indicator species and what is the likelihood of those species to inhabit a particular area or polygon, for example, and ranking biodiversity based on the presence of those indicator species. Sorry, what was the other question?
The other question was about whether there was like equal, I guess, focus placed on natural assets, like biodiversity,
yes.
or the socio-economical pieces.
Yeah, great question. So natural assets, the approach of natural assets, I sort of look at it as how a financial manager would look at ecosystem health and biodiversity. So we're not combining those two types of ideas. However, they're certainly integrated within one another. But looking and measuring natural assets, it really is a separate project that should be led by either a group of financial experts or at least having an economist in the discussion when you're looking at natural assets, identifying and developing your natural asset register, really a separate project altogether.
Fair enough. And then just last, before I broaden the question, Matt, somebody had a question about your 5-step process and sort of what your anticipated timeline would be for that.
Yeah, great question. So as most of us know, we're not entirely in charge of timelines, but I anticipate that we'll have the analysis for the biodiversity work completed by the spring of 2024. Following that work, we'll do some detailed and broader engagement with the community, with partner groups, as well as internal engagement, and then looking at maybe a final biodiversity strategy by the end of 2025 or somewhere around then.
Great. So the last couple of questions, and I'll open it up to all 3 panel members to respond, is more about support and engagement. So there's a question here about how do we continue to encourage local governments to implement green bylaws, and how is there anything that we can do to support initiatives more generally? Are apps like iNaturalist helpful in tracking or logging invasive species data or biodiversity data? So more general questions about how best to support some of these initiatives.
I can jump in there and then others can follow. Yeah, I agree. Apps like iNaturalist, they really do play a crucial role in some of the citizen science efforts. So if you're not familiar, it allows individuals to document observations of plants, animals, other organisms in their natural habitats. And so we are all for our community using those types of technology to identify species within the district. And that data will be used and gathered as part of the biodiversity strategy. In terms of other types of engagement, getting involved with your stewardship groups, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We can augment the existing stewardship groups in ways through the biodiversity strategy. So getting involved in those existing stewardship groups is really one of the best ways you can take action on the ground.
Wonderful. Brianne or Yolanda, did you want to add anything there?
I would just add to continue to let your council know that that's a priority to you. I think we're in a really interesting time especially with all this housing legislation coming through, that's going to take up a lot of attention of local governments for the coming months at least, and probably beyond. So just if there are engagement opportunities associated with environmental green bylaw projects, so just make sure you're coming out and your voice is being heard, because increasing numbers with those engagements can show also that that's a priority to the community.
That's a great point.
I second Brianne's point about advocating for the things that you're interested in. If that's, natural vegetation, passive park uses, those kinds of things that, might not have an organized lobby group. Make sure your interests are known and shared with your elected officials.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I think we're on time. I'm going to pass it back over to Renee, who I think has a few closing words before we say goodbye. Over to you, Renee.
Yes, I do have a few closing words. Thank you. I'm having trouble sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see it just now. Yeah.
Yep, we can see it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for this super engaging conversation. I learned so much today, and I hope everybody else did too. And I really thank everybody who came to join us for lunch. And I'd particularly like to give special thanks to our partners and funders for the Green Bylaws Toolkit, and remind you that you can access the Green Bylaws Toolkit by going to the stewardshipcenterbc.ca website, green/bylaws. I will be sending out a recording of this webinar, as well as some links to access some pertinent documents, including some of the links that were mentioned by our panelists during today's webinar. And I wish you all the very best of the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.